Thank you for joining us for another part of a series by Battlefront Living History Group Malta on British shell and cartridge casings. I'm Gianluca, and today we're going to look specifically at two shells that are identical in caliber but are not really interchangeable. So we are meant for two different guns, pretty much. Before the First World War, the British Admiralty made the decision to convert or to replace in service a number of guns, specifically the primary guns on cruisers and destroyers mostly, that were of the BL designation, BL standing for breech loading. And they specifically replaced them with a gun that is known, the designation is of QF, quick firing. Now the interesting thing is that both QF and BL, so both breech loading and quick firing guns in British service, are loaded from the breech, are breech loaded. So where is the difference? The difference is that whereas the breech loading guns were still loaded with bagged charges as propellants, the QF guns, the quick firing guns, had the propellant encased, contained within a brass cartridge casing, just like this one. So in 1914, the quick firing 4-inch Mark V gun entered service, replacing the breech loading 4-inch Mark VII. And at the beginning, naturally in 1914, no aircraft were in military service, or at least certainly not to the extent you had later on in the First World War. The first mount for this particular gun was a low-angle mount with a maximum elevation of just 30 degrees. And its primary role was obviously on smaller ships like destroyers, light cruisers and so on, as a primary armament, especially the smaller vessels, and as a secondary armament on some of the larger vessels as well, such as heavy cruisers and so on. And later on during the war, then, the First World War of course, you had a transition. Well, not necessarily, but the gun was also adapted to fit a high angle mount, which came into service around the time of the end of the First World War. And this allowed the gun to gain an elevation of up to 80 degrees. However, it was also noted that from an elevation of 62 degrees up, the gun actually couldn't be loaded. And that obviously was a problem, particularly because the gun had to be de-elevated beneath 62 degrees to be reloaded, which was a problem because it obviously slowed the rate of fire of the gun and potentially the accuracy as well as the target acquisition. The gun was replaced by the quick-firing 4-inch Mark 16 gun in 1936. Though it actually would go on, the Mark V would go on to soldier on until the end of the Second World War in 1945. The reason for the change, at least certainly, is obviously the fixing of the issue with the gun not being able to be reloaded when elevated at an angle of 62 degrees or more. The new quick-firing 4-inch Mark 16 gun had the advantage of being a true dual-purpose gun. In a twin configuration, it could very effectively engage surface targets but also ground installations, which is something that was seen during the Second World War. However, in addition, it still benefited from an 80-degree elevation, so it could still act as an effective heavy anti-aircraft gun against high-flying aircraft, bombers, and so on. Both the Mark V and the Mark 16 systems made use of the same caliber. The caliber was of 102 by 730 R. That is the metric designation. This refers to the neck diameter of 102 millimeters, the casing length of 730 millimeters, and the R, which stands for rimmed. The rim protruding at the base of both cartridges. What is also interesting, however, is that though, like I've mentioned earlier, though these two casings are of the same caliber, they're not actually interchangeable. And though both guns pretty much are linked in their history, they couldn't make use of the same ammunition. Really, the one defining figure, apart from obviously the different shape of the two casings, is the rim diameter, so the rim at the bottom of the shell casing. One has a rim diameter of 72 millimeters in the case of the Mark V ammunition, whereas the ammunition for the Mark 16 system has a rim diameter of 74 millimeters, so a change of just 2 millimeters, which makes both casings not really interchangeable in that respect. Both systems, so the 4-inch Mark V and the 4-inch Mark 16, saw primarily naval service with the forces of the British Commonwealth. However, there were a number of exceptions. Throughout the service life of the Mark V, the Mark V gun was also used in a number of different roles, including coastal defense. And in particular, in Malta, it very interestingly served also in the role of practically an inland artillery piece. So, for those of you who are familiar with Malta's fortifications, if one had to mention the Corradino lines in Marsa, so at the harbour area of Malta, the Corradino lines were naturally obsolete, as some of you might know, by that time being a Victorian-era fortification. However, very interestingly, as with other types of fortification erected by both the Order of St. John or the British government in Malta, the Corradino lines were actually reused, repurposed during the Second World War, naturally as a result of a threat of invasion by Axis forces. And one of the things that happened at the Corradino lines at the Second World War, apart from it being repurposed as an infantry entrenchment, was the placement of a single quick-firing 4-inch Mark V gun, pretty much inland. The Corradino lines themselves were not a coastal fortification, and the gun itself actually served the purpose of a field artillery piece almost. So it is a very interesting, where basically a gun is being recycled by then relatively obsolescent, but not necessarily obsolete. Like I said, the Mark V gun was continued being used until 1945. And it actually had a role prepared for it in case of enemy invasion. And that is pretty much, apart from naturally the naval links with Malta, which for a long while was the base for the British Mediterranean Fleet, another link between this particular gun and the Maltese Islands.